30 days ago, 53-year-old David Callahan committed a fatal act against his girlfriend, Martha, and buried her right in his own backyard. David believed he had executed the perfect crime and would vanish into the shadows unpunished. He relied on the fact that Martha struggled with mental health issues and had few friends, convinced that no one would ever come looking for her. But there was one thing he did not account for. Martha's daughter, Kim, was the only person who refused to accept her mother's sudden silence. Before she vanished, the victim left behind a chilling warning. "If I come up missing or dead, it is no accident." Although the authorities were initially skeptical due to a lack of evidence, this daughter would do whatever it took to force them to act, leading them to one of the most haunting discoveries buried beneath the earth. How long can a man hide a dark secret when a daughter refuses to give up? Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now to support us. And let us dive into this intense investigation immediately. The patrol car rolled to a stop in front of the small, unassuming house. It was a call the officers had responded to before, a familiar address in their logbooks. The dispatcher had relayed a request from a woman asking for help with a restraining order against her boyfriend. To the officers inside the vehicle, it sounded like a routine domestic disturbance, the kind they handled multiple times a week. They stepped out of the car, their boots hitting the pavement with a heavy, rhythmic thud, unaware that they were walking into the final moments of a tragedy. Martha stood on the porch, waiting for them. She looked anxious, her eyes darting between the officers and the closed front door behind her. She was a woman who had lived a hard life, and her history with the local police was long and complicated. The officers knew her name. They knew her diagnosis. Martha struggled with severe mental health challenges, specifically schizophrenia, which often made her communications difficult to follow. Today, however, her distress was palpable, vibrating off her like a heat wave. "Hi," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly as the officers approached the steps. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold her shattered nerves together. "What is going on, Martha?" one of the officers asked, his tone weary. He did not sound unkind, but he sounded tired. He had expected a clear emergency, but instead, he found Martha standing alone, looking confused. "Did you call us?" "Yes, I did," Martha replied quickly, the words tumbling out over one another. "I am looking to reinstate some. 14 months ago. I think 10 years, right?" The officers exchanged a glance. This was the pattern they were used to. Martha's sentences often looped back on themselves, mixing past and present, reality and delusion. It was difficult for them to parse the immediate danger from the noise of her illness. "So, you want to reinstate something you already have?" the officer asked, trying to clarify. "Are they already investigating it, and you are just telling us about it again?" Martha shook her head, frustration creeping into her expression. She knew what she needed, but the words were failing her. Inside the house, just beyond the thin barrier of the front door, David was waiting. She knew he was there. She knew he was listening. The fear of him was a sharp, cold knot in her chest. But when she tried to speak of it, her mind scattered the thought. "Well, I do not know if they are investigating or not," Martha stammered. "All I know is I cry, training order them, and then I give away for her to get some mental help because he is supposed to go went down first path." Her speech was becoming disorganized. To the officers, it sounded like word salad, a common symptom where language becomes a confused jumble. They saw a woman having an episode, not a woman pleading for her life. They did not see the terror behind her eyes. They only heard the confusion in her voice. "First of all, it was not supposed to be exploited at all," Martha added, her voice dropping to a whisper. She glanced back at the door again. The officers shifted their weight, their hands resting near their belts. They assessed the situation based on what they could see. There was no active fight. There were no visible weapons. There was only Martha, talking in circles about things that had happened months or years ago. They did not sense the immediate threat that was lurking just feet away. Inside the house, David stood in the silence of the living room. He was motionless, his body tense with suppressed rage. He could hear every word Martha said to the police. He heard her trying to turn him in. He heard her trying to get the protection order back. His anger was not a hot, explosive thing. It was a cold, calculated pressure building behind his eyes. He waited for the police to leave. He knew they would. They always did. They looked at Martha and saw a nuisance, a file of paperwork, a waste of time. David counted on that. He counted on their indifference. Outside, the conversation was stalling. "Can you come out and do that with a madman?" Martha asked, a sudden moment of clarity cutting through her confusion. "Right. I got a restraining order against him, and then, I do not know what." She trailed off, sensing the officers were losing patience. She tried to pivot, to make them understand that she was unsafe. "What are you doing over there?" she asked suddenly, looking at one officer who had stepped to the side to survey the yard. "I am talking to you," the officer replied calmly. "Why are you over there like that?" "Because I want to be," Martha said, her defiance flickering weakly. "Okay. Walk off to the guy downtown." "Okay. Okay." It was over. The officers had decided. There was nothing here for them to do. They could not arrest someone based on a confused conversation about expired paperwork. They could not force entry into a home where everything appeared quiet. In their eyes, Martha was simply off her medication again. "All right, Martha," the officer said, stepping back toward the patrol car. "You call us if something changes, okay?" Martha stood frozen on the porch. She watched them turn their backs. She wanted to scream that he was inside, that he was going to hurt her, that this time was different. But her voice locked in her throat. The system that was supposed to protect her was walking away, dismissing her fear as a symptom of her mind. The car engine started with a low rumble. The officers got in, checked their mirrors, and began to pull away from the curb. They radioed in that the situation was stable, just a routine check with no incident. They drove down the street, the house shrinking in their rearview mirror until it disappeared around the corner. Silence descended on the neighborhood. Martha remained on the porch for a long moment. The humid air felt heavy against her skin. She looked down the empty street, the space where the police car had been just seconds ago. Now, there was no one, no witnesses, no protection. Slowly, heavily, she turned toward the front door. She knew she had to go back inside. She had nowhere else to go. As her hand touched the doorknob, the metal felt cold under her palm. She pushed the door open and stepped into the dim interior of the house. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the world. From the shadows of the hallway, a figure emerged. David stepped into the light. He did not shout. He did not scream. He simply looked at her with eyes that held no empathy, only a dark, finalizing resolve. He had heard everything. He knew she had tried to call for help, and now he knew that no one was coming back. The last barrier between Martha and her fate had just driven away. The house was quiet, disturbingly so. It was the kind of silence that happens before a storm, the heavy, suffocating pause before the world breaks apart. Martha backed away, but the wall was behind her. There was no more running. The police were gone. The neighbors were inside their own homes. She was alone with the consequence of her call. And in that quiet living room, as the afternoon light began to fade, the real horror was about to begin. 30 days had passed since the police car drove away from Martha's curb, leaving her alone on the porch. To the rest of the world, the days moved forward with their usual rhythm. The sun rose and set, neighbors went to work, and the city of Akron continued its busy, noisy existence. But for Kim, Martha's daughter, time had begun to warp into something agonizing and slow. The silence that had descended over her mother's life was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly absolute. Kim was accustomed to chaos. Growing up with a mother who struggled with schizophrenia meant navigating a life of unpredictability. Martha was a woman of high highs and low lows, a person whose mind often took her to places her family could not follow. There were days of erratic phone calls, days of paranoia, and days of loud arguments. But the one thing Martha never did was disappear completely. Even in her worst episodes, she reached out. She called Kim, she called her cousins, and she called her brother. Her presence was a constant, noisy static in their lives. But now, the static had cut out. For the first few days, Kim told herself it was just another phase. Perhaps Martha and David were fighting again. Their relationship was a volatile cycle of breaking up and making up, a toxic loop that exhausted everyone around them. It was possible, Kim reasoned, that they were simply lying low, caught up in another dramatic reconciliation or dispute. But as the first week bled into the second, the unease in Kim's stomach hardened into dread. She began to call her mother's phone with increasing desperation. Every morning, before she even had her coffee, she would dial the familiar number. Every morning, she was met with the same result, the hollow ringing, followed by the automated voicemail. She left messages, her voice shifting from casual check-ins to pleading demands. She asked her mother just to pick up, just to say a single word to prove she was okay. But the phone remained unanswered, a digital void that swallowed her words. Kim started to reach out to the rest of the family. She called Martha's cousin, a woman Martha spoke to constantly. "Have you heard from her?" Kim asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Not a word," the cousin replied, her own worry evident. "It has been weeks. She never goes this long without asking for something or just checking in." Kim called her uncle, Martha's brother. He, too, had heard nothing. The network of family that usually managed Martha's ups and downs realized that for the first time in years, the line had gone dead. Martha was not in the hospital. She was not in jail. She was simply gone. It was then that a chilling memory resurfaced in Kim's mind, a conversation that had taken place not long before the silence began. Martha had been lucid that day, frighteningly so. She had looked Kim in the eyes, her expression stripped of its usual confusion, and delivered a warning that now echoed like a prophecy. "If I come up missing or dead," Martha had said, her voice steady and grim, "it is no accident." Kim remembered the cold shiver that had run down her spine. Martha had been terrified of David. She had told her family about his threats. David had not just threatened to hurt her. He had been specific. He had told Martha that if he ever decided to end things, he would make sure nobody ever found her. He had promised to erase her, to hide her away in the dark where her family would search forever and find nothing. At the time, the family had hoped it was just the paranoia talking, or perhaps just the ugly heat of an argument. But now, with every unanswered call, those words felt less like a fear and more like a promise kept. Kim decided she could no longer wait for her mother to surface on her own. She drove to the house, hoping against hope that she would find Martha sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette, wondering what all the fuss was about. But when Kim arrived, the house stood silent and still. The blinds were drawn. The yard was quiet. There was no movement, no sign of life. She knocked on the door, pounding with her fist until her hand hurt, calling out her mother's name. "Mom, open up. It is Kim." Nothing. She tried the handle, but it was locked. She moved around to the windows, peering into the dim interior. She could not see much, but the stillness inside was unnerving. It felt like a tomb. Standing there on the driveway, Kim felt a surge of anger mix with her fear. She knew David. She knew his history. He was a man with a lengthy criminal record, a man who had outstanding warrants for theft and substance issues. He was not someone who played by the rules. If Martha was gone, David was the key. Kim realized she was out of options. She could not break down the door herself, and she could not find David on her own. She needed help. She needed the authority of the badge. She pulled out her phone and dialed the police again, her fingers trembling. "I need to report something," Kim said when the dispatcher answered. "My mother is missing. I have not heard from her in weeks. Her boyfriend threatened to kill her, and now she is gone." She explained the situation, her voice rising with urgency. She told them about the schizophrenia, the lack of contact, the threats. She told them that this was not a normal silence. This was the silence of someone who had been silenced. The police agreed to meet her at the house for a welfare check. Kim hung up the phone and waited in her car, watching the house. She stared at the front door, willing it to open, willing her mother to walk out and yell at her for overreacting. But the door stayed shut. The only thing that moved was the wind in the trees and the shadows stretching across the lawn. Kim gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She did not know it yet, but she was about to enter a battle not just against a killer, but against a system that would struggle to believe her. She was the only one who saw the truth through the fog of her mother's illness. To the world, Martha was a troubled woman who had wandered off. To Kim, she was a victim waiting to be found. And as the police cruiser turned the corner at the end of the street, Kim made a silent vow. She would not stop screaming until someone listened. She would not let David's promise come true. She would find her mother, no matter what she had to dig through to get to the truth. The gravel of the driveway crunched under the tires of the police cruiser as it pulled up behind Kim's vehicle. It was later in the day now, the sun beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the front yard of Martha's home. Kim stood next to her car, her husband by her side, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She watched the officers step out of their vehicle. They adjusted their belts and hats, their movements practiced and calm, a sharp contrast to the storm of anxiety raging inside Kim. She needed them to understand. That was the only thought running through her mind. She needed them to look past the file they likely pulled up on the computer in their car, the file that labeled her mother as unstable, difficult, and prone to false alarms. She needed them to see the reality of the danger Martha was in. "Thank you for coming," Kim said as the officers approached. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. "We have been knocking, but there is no answer. And like I said on the phone, nobody has heard from her." One of the officers, a man with a skeptical expression, nodded. He glanced at the silent house and then back at Kim. "And you said she lives here alone?" "She lives here with her boyfriend, David," Kim corrected quickly. Well, he stays here. It is complicated. But neither of them is answering. And that is why I am terrified. Kim took a deep breath, preparing to lay out the darkest parts of her mother's life. She knew how it sounded to strangers. It sounded like drama. It sounded like a domestic dispute that would blow over in a day or two. But she had to make them hear the threat. "My mother has paranoid schizophrenia," Kim explained, looking directly into the officer's eyes. "I know what that looks like on paper. I know you guys probably have a history of calls here. But you have to listen to me. She does not just vanish. Even when she is having a bad episode, she calls us. She calls her brother. She calls her cousin. She is loud. She makes her presence known. This silence? This is not her. This is wrong." The officer shifted his weight, resting his hand on his vest. "Has she ever gone off her medication before and wandered away?" "Yes, she has struggles," Kim admitted, frustration rising in her throat. "But that is not what this is. This is about David." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if David himself might be listening from the bushes. "There is a history of violence there. They fight constantly. But recently, it changed. It got darker. David has made threats to her, officer. Serious threats." The officers exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication that said they had heard this story 1,000 times before. "What kind of threats?" the second officer asked, taking out a notepad. "He told her that he was going to end her," Kim said, forcing herself to say the words clearly. "He did not just say he would hurt her. He told her, specifically, that if he ever decided to do it, he would make sure nobody ever found her. He said he would get her, and nobody would ever see her again." The words hung in the air between them. Kim watched the officers' faces, waiting for a reaction, waiting for the urgency to spark in their eyes. She wanted them to pull their weapons, to kick down the door, to tear the house apart looking for her mother. But the officers remained calm, almost detachably so. "Those are serious accusations," the officer said, writing something down. "But without proof of a crime right now, and without seeing any signs of a struggle from the outside, our hands are tied. We can knock, we can look around the perimeter, but we cannot force our way in just because they are not answering the door." "But he threatened to hide her," Kim insisted, her voice cracking. "If she is in there, and she is hurt, or worse, and he is hiding her, you are the only ones who can help." The officers turned toward the house. They walked up the path to the front porch, Kim and her husband following a few steps behind. The officer banged his fist on the door, 3 loud, authoritative knocks that echoed through the wood. "Police department. Anyone inside?" he shouted. Silence. He knocked again. "Martha? David? If you are in there, come to the door." Still nothing. The house stood completely still. The blinds were drawn tight. The air around them was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. And then a sound cut through the stillness. It was a sudden mechanical clunk, followed by a descending whirring noise. The air conditioning unit, which sat in the side window, abruptly powered down. The hum of the fan stopped, leaving a sudden, heavy silence in its wake. Kim's head snapped toward the window. "Did you hear that?" she whispered urgently, grabbing her husband's arm. "The AC just turned off. Someone turned it off." The officer looked at the window, frowning slightly. He paused, listening. "It probably just cycled off," he said with a shrug. "Those old units run on a thermostat. It reached the temperature and shut down. It happens." "No," Kim said, shaking her head, her heart pounding against her ribs. "It was running. Someone inside heard us. Someone turned it off to be quiet. They are in there. I know they are in there." She looked at the officers, pleading with her eyes. This was it. This was the sign of life. A machine does not just decide to shut down at the exact moment the police start pounding on the door unless someone is trying to hide. "Officer, please," Kim begged. "That is not a coincidence. David is in there. He is hiding. You have to go in." The officer sighed, a sound of patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, an air conditioner turning off is not probable cause to break down a door. It is a mechanical device. It cycles. We have knocked. We have announced ourselves. There is no answer. There is no screaming. There is no smell of gas or smoke. There is no visual on a person in distress." He turned back to Kim, his demeanor firm but final. "We cannot enter the home. We cannot violate their rights based on a noise from an appliance." Kim felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. She stared at the window, knowing in her gut that on the other side of that glass, someone was standing in the dark, holding their breath, waiting for them to leave. She felt the presence of malice radiating from the house, unbeknownst to the officers, and confirming Kim's worst nightmare. David was indeed inside. He stood pressed against the wall in the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest. He had heard the pounding. He had heard the police announcing themselves. Panic had spiked in his blood. He had rushed to the window unit and killed the power, terrified that the noise of the fan would mask the sound of the police movements, or worse, that they would hear him moving inside. Now, he stood in the suffocating silence of the living room, listening to the muffled voices on the porch. He heard Kim pleading. He heard the police dismissing her. A cold smirk touched his lips. They were not coming in. They were following the rules. And the rules were protecting him, not Martha. Outside, the officer put his notepad away. "We will document that we came out here," he told Kim. "But for now, there is nothing else we can do. If you hear from her, or if you see David, call us back." Kim watched them walk back to their car. The opportunity was slipping away. The house remained a fortress of secrets, guarding the terrible truth inside. The police engine started, and for the second time in this tragedy, the law drove away, leaving a predator safe behind locked doors and a daughter standing in the driveway, screaming silently at a world that refused to listen. The silence of the air conditioner still hung heavy in the air, a mechanical gasp that had been cut short, but the officers on the porch had already moved past it. To them, the noise was just a coincidence, a machine doing what machines do. To Kim, it was a signal, a desperate flag waved from the darkness of the house, but she could not make them see it. The moment for immediate action had passed, swallowed up by procedure and protocol. Now, they were standing on the driveway, and the conversation shifted from physical entry to administrative paperwork. This was where the tragedy would be sealed, not by violence, but by a well-meaning but catastrophic piece of advice. Kim stood with her arms wrapped around herself, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly turning into a cold, sinking nausea. She looked at the officer, pleading with her eyes for a solution. If they would not break down the door, surely they could start a search. Surely they could put her mother's face on a bulletin board or send out an alert. "Okay, Kim said, her voice steadying as she tried to be practical. If you cannot go in, then I need to file a missing person report. Right now. She has been gone for weeks. I need to make this official so that if she is in a hospital or somewhere else, we can find her. The officer sighed, shifting his stance. He adjusted his belt, looking down at Kim with a mixture of sympathy and professional fatigue. He did not dismiss her outright, but his next words would build a wall between Kim and the help she so desperately needed. Here is the thing, the officer began, his tone reasonable and calm. We can take a report, but you have to understand the situation with your mother's condition. You mentioned she has paranoid schizophrenia, right? Yes, Kim nodded. That is why she is vulnerable. Right, the officer continued. But that also complicates things. Martha is a grown woman. She is an adult. Legally, she has the right to go missing if she wants to. She has the right to not answer her phone. She has the right to cut off contact with her family if she is having an episode or just wants to be alone. Kim felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. This is not her wanting to be alone. David threatened her. I understand that is your concern, the officer said, holding up a hand to calm her. But let's look at the logistics. If she is having a mental health crisis, she might have checked herself into a facility, or maybe she was taken to one. If that is the case, privacy laws are very strict. Even if you are her daughter, the hospital is legally not allowed to tell anybody anything, not even her kin. If she does not want to be found, they cannot tell us she is there. The officer's logic was sound, factually speaking. The laws were designed to protect patient privacy, but in this specific driveway, at this specific moment, those laws were being used as a reason to do nothing. So what are you saying? Kim asked, her voice trembling. I should just wait? I am saying that I do not think we are quite at the heightened alert level that we need to be to force entry or launch a full-scale manhunt, the officer explained. The way she calls us constantly, the history here, it gives us a false sense of alarm. If we file a report now, and she is just in a hospital cooling off, it creates a lot of paperwork and confusion for something that might resolve itself in a few days. He paused, looking at Kim with what he thought was reassurance. My advice? Give it a little more time. Check the hospitals yourself if you can, though they might not talk to you. But filing a report right this second might not get you the result you want if she is just in treatment. Kim stared at him, stunned. She was being told, effectively, that her mother's history of mental illness was a reason to delay looking for her. The officer was viewing Martha's silence not as a sign of danger, but as a symptom of her condition. They assumed she was hiding from the world, not that she had been hidden by someone else. But the threats, Kim whispered, feeling her argument crumbling against the weight of their indifference. David said, We made a note of it, the officer said, closing his notebook with a finality that sounded like a door slamming shut. We will keep an eye out. But honestly, she is probably just taking a break. It happens. The advice hung in the air. Do not file the report yet. It was a suggestion born of bureaucracy and assumption. The officers believed they were saving everyone time and paperwork on a case that would likely end with Martha walking back through the front door in a week, complaining about her medication. They could not see the future. They could not know that this decision would cost the investigation critical weeks. They could not know that by dissuading Kim from making it official, they were giving David the one thing a person with a guilty conscience needs most: time. Okay, Kim said softly, defeated. She felt small and powerless. The uniform, the badge, the confident tone of the officer, it all made her question her own instincts. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Martha was sitting in a quiet room somewhere, safe and angry, just waiting to come home. We will clear out now, the officer said, nodding to his partner. Call us if you hear anything. Kim watched them get back into the cruiser. The engine turned over, and the car backed out of the driveway, rolling away down the street. For the second time, the police left the scene. Kim stood alone on the pavement. The advice to wait echoed in her mind. It felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal. But she had been inadvertently coerced into silence by the very people she had gone to for a voice. She looked back at the house one last time. It loomed over her, silent and secretive. She felt the heavy gaze of the windows, the secrets buried behind the walls. She got into her own car, her hands gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She would wait, as they suggested. She would try to find Martha on her own. But deep in her gut, a cold, hard knot of fear told her that the bureaucratic wall she had just hit was not protecting her mother's privacy. It was protecting the man who had turned off the air conditioner. It was protecting a lie. And as she drove away, leaving the house in the rearview mirror, Kim realized with a terrifying clarity that if she wanted to find her mother, she was going to have to do it alone. The system had not just failed, it had actively stepped aside. 1 week had crawled by since the police left the driveway. It was a week of agonizing obedience for Kim. She had followed the advice of the officers, forcing herself to wait, forcing herself to believe the narrative that her mother was simply taking a break from the world. She checked the local hospitals, calling the intake desks and asking for Martha. But every call ended the same way. The staff would recite the privacy laws, refusing to confirm or deny if her mother was a patient. It was a wall of bureaucracy that Kim could not climb, just as the officer had predicted. But the silence was the loudest thing in Kim's life. It filled the space where her mother's chaotic energy used to be. Every day that passed without a phone call felt less like a break and more like a permanent severance. Kim kept her phone charged and close to her hand at every moment, sleeping with it on the pillow beside her, waiting for the screen to light up. Then, the impossible happened. The phone buzzed in her hand. Kim looked down, her heart skipping a beat. The name on the screen was Mom. For a split second, relief washed over her, hot and overwhelming. She fumbled to unlock the screen, her fingers trembling. She expected a long, rambling message, or perhaps a voice note explaining where she had been. She expected the familiar voice of her mother. But when she opened the text thread, the message was short. It was 3 words. "I am busy." Kim stared at the screen. The relief evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling confusion. Busy was not a word Martha used with her daughter. Not like this. Martha would have called. She would have explained. She would have asked for something. This message was cold, dismissive, and utterly unlike her. Kim typed back immediately, her thumbs flying over the keypad. "Mom, is that you? Where are you? We have been so worried." The 3 dots of a typing indicator appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, a new message popped up. "I am with my friends. I am fine." Kim narrowed her eyes. The grammar was perfect. The spelling was correct. The tone was detached. This did not sound like a woman in the middle of a schizophrenic episode. It did not sound like a woman who had been missing for weeks. It sounded like someone trying to end a conversation as quickly as possible. It sounded like a stranger. Suspicion began to harden into certainty in Kim's gut. She knew her mother's voice, both spoken and written. Martha's texts were usually sporadic, full of emotion, sometimes hard to decipher. These texts were calculated. They were designed to reassure, to make Kim back off, to make the police stop looking. Kim decided to test the person on the other end of the line. She needed to prove that the person holding the phone was not Martha. She needed to set a trap. "Okay," Kim typed, forcing herself to sound calm. "I just want to see you. I want to know you are safe. Tell me where you are, and I will come to you." The reply came slower this time. The person on the other end was hesitating, calculating. "I am at the Kingdom Hall in Kent with friends." Kim stared at the location. It was a plausible lie. Martha had connections to the church, but Kim knew that if she drove there, she would find an empty hall. She decided to spring the trap. She needed to see how the texter would react to an immediate threat of discovery. "Okay," Kim wrote back instantly. "Stay there. I am coming right now. Do not move." The reaction was immediate and frantic. The cool, detached tone of the previous messages vanished, replaced by a sudden pivot that made no sense. "Oh, I am not there," the new message read. "You do not know where I am." Kim watched the messages appear, her blood running cold. "Well, you just said you were there," Kim typed back, her anger rising. "Where are you really?" "Oh, I am eating now," the reply came. The lie had collapsed. Whoever was holding the phone had realized their mistake. They had given a location, and the moment Kim threatened to verify it, they panicked. They claimed to be at a church, then suddenly claimed to be eating somewhere else, somewhere hidden. A person who wants to be found does not run when their daughter offers to pick them up. A person who is safe does not lie about their location. Kim lowered the phone, her hand shaking uncontrollably. The ghostly hope that her mother was alive and well had just been extinguished. She looked at the blank screen, realizing with a horrifying clarity that she had not been talking to her mother. She had been talking to the person who had taken her. The phrasing, the evasion, the sudden change in story. It all pointed to one person. It was David. He had her phone. He was reading Kim's desperate messages and replying with cold, manipulative lies to buy himself more time. He was impersonating a woman he had promised to make disappear. The realization shifted something inside Kim. The sadness was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning rage. The police had told her to wait. They had told her to respect her mother's privacy, but there was no privacy here. There was only a predator using technology to hide his crime. David thought he was being clever. He thought he could fool the family with a few text messages. But he had just made a critical error. He had engaged. He had proven that Martha's phone was active, and by lying about her location, he had proven that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Kim grabbed her car keys. She was done waiting. She was done listening to advice about paperwork and protocols. She had the proof she needed. She had a digital trail of lies. She was going back to the police station, and this time, she would not be turned away. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and it had revealed the monster hiding behind the screen. The digital deception of the text messages was the catalyst Kim needed. The fear that had paralyzed her for weeks was now replaced by a cold, driving determination. She drove to meet the police not as a worried daughter asking for a favor, but as a witness presenting evidence of a crime. She showed them the phone, pointing out the contradictions, the sudden changes in location, and the cold, impersonal tone that did not match her mother's voice. She explained that the person holding that phone had claimed to be in two places at once and then refused to be seen. That was not the behavior of a woman taking a break. That was the behavior of a suspect covering his tracks. Faced with this new, tangible inconsistency, the resistance from the authorities finally cracked. The officers agreed to meet her at the property again. This time, the intention was not just to knock and leave. This time, they would enter the home. When they arrived, the house stood as silent as it had been for the last month. The air was still. The windows were dark. The officers approached the door, their demeanor more serious now. They called out, announcing their presence, their voices booming against the wood. "Police department, come to the door." There was no answer. No movement inside. No sound of a television or footsteps. With Kim standing anxiously behind them, the officers made their way in. Kim stepped across the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. She braced herself for what she might find. She expected chaos. She expected to see the signs of a struggle, broken furniture, or the disarray that often accompanied her mother's more difficult days. She expected a scene that screamed violence. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. Order. The house was quiet. It was tidy. It was empty. Kim moved through the living room, her eyes scanning every surface. To a stranger, or to the police officers walking beside her, the room looked like a normal, inhabited space. There were no holes in the walls. There was no glass on the floor. But Kim knew this house. She knew the rhythm of her mother's life. And she knew that Martha did not live in a state of minimalism. "Where are her shoes?" Kim asked, her voice tight. She walked to the spot by the door where Martha always kicked off her footwear. Martha loved shoes. She had pairs scattered everywhere, sandals, sneakers, slippers. They were usually a tripping hazard, a colorful pile of clutter that defined the entryway. Now, the floor was bare. Kim moved to the bedroom. She checked the closet. She checked under the bed. "Not a single pair of her shoes is anywhere," Kim said, turning to the officer. "If she left on her own, She would have taken one pair, maybe two. She would not have taken every single shoe she owned. That is impossible. The officer looked around, unimpressed. Maybe she packed them, he suggested. If she moved out to live with a friend, she would take her belongings. She did not move out, Kim insisted. Look at the rest of the house. Her furniture is here. Her clothes are here. Why would she take only her shoes? Kim rushed to the kitchen. This was the true test. She grabbed the handle of the refrigerator and pulled it open. The light flickered on, illuminating the wire shelves. They were empty. Kim stared at the white plastic interior, a chill running through her veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. "There is no Pepsi," Kim whispered. The officer frowned. "I am sorry?" "Pepsi," Kim said, turning to face him, her eyes wide with panic. "My mother drinks Pepsi every single day. She is never without it. If she was living here, there would be bottles in here. If she was staying here, this fridge would be full. The fact that it is empty means she has not been here in a long time." To Kim, the empty shelf was a screaming siren. It was proof that life in this house had stopped weeks ago. But the officers saw it differently. They saw a clean house. They saw a lack of distress. They interpreted the absence of clutter as an absence of conflict. "If I were you," the officer said, trying to be reassuring but failing miserably, "I would be relieved. It does not look like there are any signs of distress. Her stuff is not thrown around. It looks peaceful. It looks staged," Kim countered, her frustration boiling over. He cleared it out. He got rid of the things that would make it look like she was here. He did something to her, and then he cleaned up. The officers walked through the rest of the house, checking the bathrooms and the back rooms. They found nothing. No note, no address book. Just the heavy, oppressive silence of a home that had been abandoned. As they walked back toward the front door, preparing to leave, one of the officers paused. He looked at Kim, his expression shifting from professional detachment to a momentary, dark curiosity. It was a slip of the mask, a glimpse into the grim possibilities that law enforcement dealt with every day. "Would you have been surprised at all," the officer asked quietly, "if she was laying dead in there, or shoved in a tunnel somewhere?" The question hung in the air, heavy and grotesque. It was the first time anyone with a badge had acknowledged the reality of what Kim was feeling. They were admitting that this situation had all the markers of a tragedy, even as they refused to treat it like one. Kim looked him in the eye. She did not flinch. "Yes," she said, "I would have been surprised, but nothing surprises me anymore. That is like a horror movie." "Yeah," the officer muttered. "Nothing surprises us either." The moment passed. The officer put his professional mask back on. He told Kim that since there was no body and no sign of foul play, there was still little they could do. They could not launch a homicide investigation based on missing shoes and missing soda. Kim walked out of the house, feeling the emptiness of the building pressing against her back. The search had confirmed her worst fears, not because of what they found, but because of what was missing. The house had been stripped of the small, messy details that proved her mother was alive. As the police got into their cars to leave, Kim stood by the curb. She knew now that David had been here. He had walked these floors. He had removed the shoes. He had emptied the fridge. He was erasing Martha from existence, piece by piece, and the police were letting him do it because the erasure was tidy. They wanted a mess to investigate, but David had given them a void. And as Kim watched them drive away, she realized that she was the only one willing to stare into that void and find the truth hidden within it. Kim felt the crushing weight of the empty house settling onto her shoulders as the police drove away for the second time. They had walked through the rooms, opened the doors, and seen only a tidy, quiet home. They had viewed the missing shoes not as a scream for help, but as a packing choice. They had seen the empty refrigerator not as a sign of abandonment, but merely as a skip trip to the grocery store. To the officers, the absence of chaos was proof of safety. To Kim, the absence of life was proof that something terrible had happened. She stood on the sidewalk, watching the red taillights of the patrol car fade into the distance like the last embers of her hope. She felt foolish, clutching her phone with the fake text messages still glowing on the screen. She had given the authorities everything: the threats, the silence, the digital lies, and they had given her a shrug. They were waiting for a body, for a weapon, for something tangible. But Kim knew in her gut that by the time those things appeared, it would be far too late for a rescue. However, the dismissal was not as total as it felt. While the main patrol units filed their reports and moved on to the next call, one officer felt a nagging doubt. The silence of the house sat poorly with him. The daughter's desperation was too specific to be mere hysteria. He decided to return to the neighborhood, not to knock on the empty door again, but to look at the world around it. He wanted to see if the silence extended beyond the property line. He pulled his cruiser back onto the street a few hours later. The sun was high and bright, casting a deceptive cheerfulness over the quiet suburban road. He scanned the yards, looking for anyone who might be a watcher, anyone who lived their life with an eye on the street. He spotted a man a few houses down, working in his yard. The officer parked and walked over, the grass crunching softly under his boots. The neighbor looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, eyeing the uniform with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Good afternoon," the officer said, keeping his tone casual. "I am just following up on a welfare check for the house next door. Do you know the people who live there?" The neighbor leaned on his tool, nodding slowly. He knew them. Everyone knew them. Martha and David were not the kind of couple who lived quietly. "Yeah, I know of them," the neighbor said. "The woman, Martha, she used to ask me for cigarettes sometimes. I have not seen her in a while, though." "How long is a while?" the officer asked. "About 4 weeks," the neighbor replied. "Maybe a month. She just stopped coming around." The timeline matched Kim's story perfectly. The officer made a mental note. "What about the man? David, have you seen him?" The neighbor nodded again, casually dropping the piece of information that would shatter David's carefully constructed story. "Oh, yeah, I have seen him." The officer paused, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Recently?" "Yeah, sure," the neighbor said with a shrug. "He was here just a few days ago, maybe 3 or 4 days. He comes and goes. But he is definitely around." The officer felt a jolt of electricity run through the investigation. This contradicted everything. If David was supposed to be gone, or if he and Martha had broken up months ago as the initial assumptions suggested, he should not be creeping around the house days after she vanished. The fact that he was seen there, recently and quietly, changed the entire complexion of the case. He was not a distant ex-boyfriend. He was a present specter. "Does he drive?" the officer asked, pressing for details. "No," the neighbor said. "I never see a car for him. He just walks up. But he is around." The officer thanked the man and walked back to his cruiser, his stride faster, more purposeful. The narrative had shifted. This was no longer a welfare check for a woman who might have wandered off. This was now a hunt for a man who was lying. David was not gone. He was lurking in the margins of the timeline, entering the house where Martha's shoes were missing and her refrigerator was empty. The officer picked up his radio. The skepticism that had clouded the department's view of Kim's story began to evaporate. They had a witness, they had a timeline, and most importantly, they had a location. David was close. He was coming back to the scene of the silence. Kim was sitting in her car, tears of frustration drying on her cheeks when the news eventually reached her. It was the first validation she had received. The police were finally listening. They were setting up surveillance. If David came back, they would be waiting. For the first time in 30 days, the machinery of justice began to turn in the right direction. The wall of indifference had been breached by a simple observation from a neighbor. David had made a mistake. He had assumed he was invisible, but someone had been watching. And now, the police were watching too. The hunt had finally begun. The information from the neighbor had changed everything. The police now knew that David was not a ghost, nor was he living in Florida as he had claimed to others. He was a local specter, haunting the very home he had supposedly abandoned. Armed with this new intelligence, the police department set up a discreet surveillance operation around the property. They parked unmarked cars down the street and waited, watching the silent house for any sign of movement. For 2 long days, nothing moved. The house remained as still as a tomb. But then, on the 3rd afternoon, a vehicle pulled up to the side of the house. A man stepped out, It was David. He looked calm, casual, completely unaware that eyes were watching him from down the block. He moved with the arrogance of a man who believed he had successfully fooled everyone. The officers did not rush him immediately. They approached slowly, initiating a conversation to see what story he would spin. When they asked him where Martha was, David did not hesitate. "She is probably at her boyfriend's house," David said, his voice smooth and practiced. "She stays there most of the time now." The officers pressed him, asking for a name or an address. David shrugged, feigning ignorance. "I do not know who it is, really. We have actually been split up for a year. She comes back maybe a couple of times a week, but we are not together." He began to paint a picture of Martha as unstable and erratic. He told the officers that she had gone off her medication again, that she was paranoid, and that her family had cut ties with her because she was difficult. He tried to turn the tables, making himself look like the patient, suffering ex-partner who was just trying to live his life while Martha caused drama. It was a masterful performance of deflection. He was rewriting history in real time, hoping that if he smeared Martha's reputation enough, the police would stop looking for a victim and start blaming the missing woman for her own disappearance. The detectives listening to David knew he was lying. They had the neighbor's statement. They had the empty house. They had the text messages that did not sound like Martha. But they also knew that lies were not enough to hold him for murder. They needed physical evidence, and right now, they had none. However, a quick check of the system revealed a fatal flaw in David's plan. He had outstanding warrants for unrelated charges, minor offenses involving theft and drug abuse. It was not a murder charge, but it was enough to take him off the street. The officers played it cool. They did not confront him about the lies regarding Martha yet. Instead, they shifted the conversation. "Did you get your warrants taken care of, David?" one officer asked casually. David blinked, caught off guard. "No, I need to go down there and take care of them. I missed a couple of court dates." "Well, we are going to help you out with that today," the officer said. "We are going to take you in to get those cleared up." For the first time, David's confidence faltered, but not because he feared for Martha. He looked back at the house. "I have a big dog in there," he said, showing more concern for his pet than he had shown for the woman who had vanished. The officers assured him the dog would be handled. They allowed him to grab a few clothes, watching him closely as he walked through the house where he had allegedly lived alone for weeks. They placed him in handcuffs and led him to the patrol car. As they drove him to the station, David sat in the back, silent and brooding. He thought he was being arrested for minor administrative errors. He did not realize that this was the beginning of a cage closing around him. The police had bought themselves time. Now, they just needed to find the truth before the clock ran out on his short sentence. With David sitting in a jail cell on minor charges, the investigation hit a frustrating lull. Detectives questioned him, but he stuck to his story. Martha was crazy. She ran off with a boyfriend, and he knew nothing. Without a body or a crime scene, the police were stuck. They could not hold him forever on theft warrants. But the break in the case did not come from the interrogation room. It came from the community. Martha's family, who had been putting up flyers and desperately searching for answers, received a text message from an unknown number. It was brief, chilling, and incredibly specific. The anonymous sender wrote, if he was going to get rid of someone, he would bury them in the backyard. The family stared at the message in horror. It was the confirmation of their darkest nightmares. They immediately contacted the lead detective. The police, who had previously been hesitant to dig without probable cause, now had a direct tip pointing them to a specific location. The focus of the entire investigation shifted instantly. The house, which had been treated as a possible abandonment case, was now a potential burial site. The detectives coordinated with the family and prepared to return to the property, not to knock on the door, but to tear up the earth. The silence of the backyard was about to be broken. Before the digging began, detectives canvassed the neighborhood one last time, looking to corroborate the anonymous tip. They found the neighbor who had first spotted David. When they asked him specifically about the backyard, the neighbor's face grew pale. There was a fire pit back there, the neighbor recalled. I did not think much of it at the time because I did not know she was missing. But recently, late at night, there was a fire. The neighbor described a scene that sent chills down the detective's spines. He spoke of flames rising in the darkness, tending by a solitary figure. But it was not the sight of the fire that haunted him. It was the smell. It was a strange, unsettling odor, the neighbor said, recalling the memory. It came from the yard. It didn't smell like leaves or trash. It was distinct and alarming. The puzzle pieces slammed together. The empty house, the missing shoes, the lies, the text messages, and now, a fire with a terrible odor in the exact spot the anonymous tipster had mentioned. The police called in the cadaver dogs and the forensic team. They requested the fire department to assist with the excavation. The theory of a runaway woman had completely evaporated. They were now looking for a burn site. The atmosphere in the backyard was heavy with dread. It was a gray, overcast day. Police tape fluttered in the wind, marking off the perimeter. Firefighters and forensic anthropologists stood around the fire pit, their tools ready. Kim stood at the edge of the scene, her hands covering her mouth, watching the men work. The digging was slow and methodical. They removed the top layer of ash and charred debris. The earth was loose, suggesting it had been disturbed recently. "Careful here," one of the excavators said, his voice low. The shovel hit something that was not dirt. It was soft. It was plastic. They brushed away the soil with their gloved hands. Beneath the dirt, wrapped in layers of bedding and sealed inside heavy material, they found what they had been dreading to discover. The movement in the yard stopped. The silence that fell over the team was absolute. They had found what they were looking for. It was not a bundle of trash. It was a person. The shallow grave, hidden beneath the ashes of a fire pit, had given up its secret. The lead officer stepped away from the pit and walked toward Kim. He did not have to speak. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. The hope that had sustained her, the tiny, irrational hope that Martha was just hiding, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Did you find her?" Kim asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We found human remains," the officer said gently. "We cannot formally identify them until the medical examiner takes a look. But, given the location and the circumstances," Kim collapsed into her husband's arms. The reality of the last month crashed down on her. Her mother had not been in Florida. She had not been with friends. She had been right here, in the cold ground of her own backyard, while David lived inside the house, sleeping just yards away from where he had buried her. The police asked Kim for formal consent to continue the recovery. Through her tears, she nodded. She wanted them to take her mother out of that terrible place. She wanted dignity for Martha. As the coroner's van backed into the driveway, the neighborhood watched in solemn silence. The mystery was over, but the grief was just beginning. Back at the station, the mood had shifted from investigative curiosity to righteous anger. The detectives brought David back into the interrogation room. The time for playing games was over. They had the body. They had the evidence. "David," the detective started, his voice hard and cold. "Let me ask you a question. Are you a heartless person? Are you a cold, heartless individual who would do this?" David looked confused, trying to maintain his innocence. "No," he stammered. "Because only a monster would do what we found in that backyard," the detective continued, leaning across the table. "We found her, David. We dug up the fire pit. We know she is there. We know you cashed her checks. We know you used her phone to text her daughter." They laid out the photos on the table. The image of the fire pit, the image of the phone, the timeline of his lies. "There is no boyfriend in Florida," the detective said. "There is only you, and the woman you claimed to love, buried in the dirt. You pretended she was alive for over a month. You let her family suffer. You need to tell us the truth, David. Not for us, but to prove you have a shred of humanity left." David sat in the chair, his arrogance stripping away layer by layer. He looked at the walls, then at the floor. The weight of the evidence was crushing. There was no way to explain away a body in his own backyard. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, David asked for a cigarette. It was the white flag of surrender. "I will give you a cigarette," the detective said, "but you need to tell us what happened." David took a shaky breath. "I did not mean to do it," he mumbled. I snapped. He began to recount the story. He admitted that they had been arguing. He claimed Martha was yelling at him, and in a moment of intense anger, the situation escalated. The argument turned physical. He admitted to the fatal act that followed, confessing that he ended her life in the heat of the moment. "I got scared," David said, tears streaming down his face, tears that the detectives viewed as tears of self-pity rather than remorse. "I did not know what to do, so I made the terrible decision to conceal what had happened in the backyard." He described trying to destroy the evidence, trying to conceal what he had done, and living in the house with the secret buried just outside the window. He admitted to sending the texts to Kim, trying to buy himself time, hoping he could figure out a way to escape. But there was no escape. The confession was recorded. The details matched the forensic evidence perfectly. David Callahan was formally charged with murder and tampering with evidence. As the heavy steel door of the cell block slammed shut behind him, the story of Martha came to a tragic close. She had been a woman whose voice was often misunderstood, but in the end, her silence spoke loud enough to bring her killer to justice. Kim had kept her promise. She had found her mother, and David would spend the rest of his life in a cage, exactly where he belonged. Thank you for following this intense and heartbreaking journey with us. This case serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of persistence and the bond between a mother and daughter. If you found this story compelling, please remember to support the channel so we can continue to bring these important voices to light. Stay safe, look out for one another, and we will see you again in the next video.